The Sociology of Freedom. Manifesto of the Democratic Civilization. Volume 3. Written by Abdullah Öcalan. From Rome to Amsterdam. The distinctive feature of this period, from 500 to 1500 CE, is the rise of the Abrahamic religions. They emerged with a message meant to solve the existing problems and left their mark on this period. It is necessary to elaborate on the role of the Abrahamic religions, because although they hoped to offer a solution, in the end they created additional social problems. The social message of the Abrahamic religions suggests that the problematic material structure of the Central Civilization system was transformed into a problematic immaterial structure. In other words, the problems of the material culture echoed in the problems of the immaterial culture. The holy books clearly state that the prophet Abraham fled or emigrated from the tyranny of Nimrod, the Babylonian representative in Urfa, and the increasing problems that tyranny gave rise to. His survival and escape from being burned is presented as a miracle of divine origin. The fact that he was searching for a new God is also presented as a clear sign. We could interpret the search for God as a search for a new regime. The narrative also presents many other features of the severely problematic structure of that period. Abraham's Hejira is estimated to have occurred around 1700 BCE. This Hejira takes Abraham from civilization with Mesopotamian roots to one with Egyptian roots. This suggests that passage between the two civilizations was possible. It may be that Abraham was looking for sanctuary and a new ally. His life in Canaan, present-day Palestine and Israel, confirms this thesis. He and his family left a small tribe and formed a new one in Canaan. His grandson Joseph was sold into slavery in Egypt, where his talents saw him rise to the position of vizier in the pharaoh's palace. It is worth noting that women played an important role in the palace life and in his rise. In Hebrew history, women always played important roles. A Hebrew tribe was also formed in Egypt, but lived in semi-slavery. Tribe members suffered greatly by this. Nimrod was replaced by the pharaoh, whom he, for his part, had hoped to get rid of. It was at this point, around 1300 BCE, that Moses led the Hejira. The narrative of this journey and its many miracles is recounted in the Holy Scripture. It is similar to Abraham's story, with a return to Canaan. Compared to Egypt, Canaan was a sort of promised land. The God they sought on Mount Sinai called out to the tribe more clearly with the 10 Commandments, effectively the principles of organization and the political program of the tribe, gained from lengthy experience. The tribe firmly abandoned the religions of Nimrod and the pharaoh and established its own ethnic religion, worldview, and program. The story of the later periods is presented in a divine voice at length in the Holy Scripture, not as mythological stories, as was the case in Sumer and Egypt, but as religious rules understood as absolute. This is a major revolution in the history of religion, and a great intellectual revolution in its time. Research shows that the Hebrew tradition is one of the Middle East's most sophisticated sources of memory. I believe that the Hebrews transformed the essence of Sumerian and Egyptian mythology into a form of religious discourse or rhetoric. Throughout the historical process, the Bible was continuously developed with additions drawn from the Zoroastrian and from Babylonian, especially during the exile of 596 BCE, Phoenician, Hurrian, and Greek sources. Let's not forget that the Bible was first assembled between 700 and 600 BCE, and there are no earlier written sections. It bears saying that throughout history, the Jewish people have not only accumulated capital and money, but most impressively, ideology, science, and knowledge. They transformed their numerical inferiority into worldwide strength with the help of these two strategic accumulations. The Jewish ethnic group, initially as a tribe, nowadays as a nation, has been able to hold on to a relatively superior level of life at the margins and in strategic positions of power, not only today, but throughout time, because of these two accumulations. But the catastrophes and the terrible problems they faced were also closely related to this. When analyzing history and present developments, if we proceed methodologically from the presumption that capital and knowledge equal might and power, and that power equals monopoly over capital and knowledge, then the social problem can be understood more clearly and realistically. Here I will confine myself to a brief examination of how the Abrahamic religions caused even more complex historical and social problems, as I will examine their role in solving these enormous problems in greater detail in the section titled Envisaging a Democratic Civilization System. The Old Testament presents the post-Moses period in the form of leaders, priests, prophet rulers, prophets, and writers. It is possible to add to this intellectuals, scholars, and other similar categories for later periods. It seems that all the wisdom, priestly innovations, originating in Sumerian and Egyptian mythologies, were treated as prophetic in the Old Testament. The main task of the prophets was to solve the unprecedented social problem created by a civilization based on monopoly. If we bear in mind that surplus product and capital accumulation were procured through forced labor on the basis of enslavement and by military means, what lies behind the enormous accumulation of problems becomes clearer. Prophecy reflects the impact of this reality on the social sectors experiencing severe problems. Grasping its institutional character in this manner opens the way to a better understanding of history. We observe that Moses' ideological and political program gave birth to a small state around 1000 BCE, approximately 300 years after his death, under the reign of the prophets Saul, David, and Solomon. The solution they found to the severe social problem they faced after all of these struggles was to develop a state apparatus and rule of their own. It is clear that this state was not as democratic as the Athenian state, was a lot weaker, and had fewer options to offer than the Egyptian and Babylonian Assyrian traditions in which the Hebrew tribe had lived for such a long time. Given this, why was the Abrahamic tradition so state-focused? Because the state was the invention of the prophet, and his followers were provided the lands in Canaan as the promised land. The first Jewish state quickly collapsed as a result of familial power struggles and occupation, that is, power struggles between the sons and grandsons of David and Solomon, and Assyrian threats and occupation. It is comparable to the Israel founded in the same place 3,000 years later. However, we should pay attention to this prophetic construct, which, with the help of ideological and monetary capital, exerted great influence on the powers of central civilization throughout history. The prophet Jesus' tradition is the second most important Abrahamic religion. Its message advances a solution to the entangled problems resulting from the destructiveness of the occupying Roman forces. Jesus is called the Christ, the Messiah. It is befitting that this movement, which initiated the Gregorian calendar, has been described as the first universal party of Rome's lumpenproletariat and poor. It is far from the militant character of the Mosaic movement. It can be said to have grown out of the lower segments of the Hebrew tribe and to be the product of the circumstances in which tribal organization lost its ability to resolve problems, while the emergence of classes, urbanization, and attaining power had eroded communal values. This is the basis for its universal and class character. At the time, there was an acceleration in the dissolution of many other tribes and peoples in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Greek, Assyrian, Babylonian, and finally, Roman colonial movements exposed the unemployed and poor masses who had broken away from their tribes to hunger and homelessness, creating an intense search for a master and a Messiah. It is clear that Jesus' movement is the collective expression of that search. In fact, he calls himself the Message, and the Old Testament is renewed as the New Testament, the Bible. The civilizational culture and language at the time were Assyrian Aramaic, Babylonian Chaldean, Greek Hellenic, and Jewish Hebrew. Roman Latin was a recent arrival. It is said that Jesus spoke Aramaic, while Hellenic became quite widespread in the region during the Hellenic era. Aramaic had been the language of trade and culture in the region for around 1,000 years. Hellenic would later attain that status. Hebrew, on the other hand, as far as we know, was the language of the sacred text, with Latin finding its place more generally as the new language of ruling. No traces of Arabic had yet been encountered. Arabic was widely used among the desert tribes, becoming a civilizational language with the urbanization on the Arabian Peninsula. Arabic was to conquer the region only with the onset of the Islamic Revolution. Although traces of Persian dialects can be found, their advanced forms are only encountered within the Taurus and Zagros mountain system and in the Persian Sasanian civilization centers. Furthermore, numerous languages and cultures, especially Sumerian and Coptic, Egypt, were vitiated and eliminated by the influence of the Central Civilization. Armenian was also becoming an influential language in the region. The conflict between the two hegemonic powers over the region, with one identifying its origins in the east and the other in the west, continued at full speed. The Iranian and Caucasian-centered Sasanian Empire and the Italian and Roman-centered empire. The Mesopotamian-centered civilization, which shifted out of the region for the first time following its establishment 3,000 years earlier, continued the legacy shared by these two great hegemonic civilizations. The extremely violent wars between them were in essence about the legacy of Mesopotamian civilization. Perhaps history's most constant and intense hegemonic struggle was experienced in this period. Alexander's attacks and the resulting situation can be interpreted as the first round of this battle, but it would still be a long time before the center of civilization shifted to the west. Nonetheless, it was clear that the first steps in this direction had been taken. We can also see that Greek philosophy within the Roman Empire and the Zoroastrian doctrine, more secular and moral, within the Persian Sasanian Empire, did not solve the problems stemming from both civilization monopolies. The war between the two was in fact a reflection of this deadlock. The limited potential surplus value makes the war between the monopolies, the most popular method of accumulation, grow in number and quality. War, in essence, has been the historical means to accumulate capital and power in civilization. It has nothing to do with the stories of legendary heroes. That is the propaganda aspect. The most meaningful description is clearly that wars, including those today, are, in the final analysis, the means by which capital and power change hands. Therefore, when reading history, we need to always keep in mind that wars take place and play a role at the center of the most fundamental forces of production and their relations. In comparison, defensive wars aim to protect the land and other forces of production and their relations and freedom. In a nutshell, the identity of society, and to this end, its moral and political structure, and its democracy, if it exists. Defensive wars owe their legitimacy to this fact. Monopoly wars are often seen as the engine in the history of civilization. This is correct insofar as war has resulted in technological advances and organizational and operational innovations. However, we must not forget that wars are essentially the most antisocial, even the most unnatural phenomena and beyond brutality. Yet, they have their origins in society, since they act as a means for monopolization. In order for the society to cease being a society, they suck up the resources. The phrase, turning the other cheek, attributed to the prophet Jesus, no doubt expresses the search for great peace. It is clear that wars mean a loss of production, while peace means a substantial increase in production. Peace played a major role in Christ's movement, because it was clear that the massive unemployment and poverty at that time stemmed from the endless wars. This movement would retain this quality for 300 years, infiltrating everywhere the Romans and Sasanians went, and reverberating as far away as China and India. The Manichaean movement, similar in nature but primarily Sasanian-based, appeared during the same period and also deserves attention. The prophet Mani said, "I will personally go all the way to Rome and make peace with the Sasanians possible." If the Manichaean movement, a doctrine that combines aspects of Christianity and Zoroastrianism with a number of deeper qualities, had not been crushed by the tyrannical Sasanian rulers, it would perhaps have led to a new renaissance in the Middle East. Christianity became an official religion during the construction of Constantinople, Istanbul, and from that date, 325 CE onward, rapidly became the official ideology throughout Eastern and Western Rome. While our subject is not the history of Christianity, the relationship of Christianity to the social problem and power monopolies is an aspect of our subject. Just as the original Mosaic movement ended in a state, its renewed version, Christ's movement, also ended in power and the state. This movement not only became the official ideology of Byzantium, it became a powerful state in Rome by around 1000 CE. It indeed became much more than that. It came to be the sum of thousands of extensive and powerful society-based apparatuses of power, perhaps best referred to, both in symbolic and official terms, as the state. For our purposes, the internal strife within Christianity, conflicts between the Catholics and Orthodox, and the rise of other famous denominations are only important for indicating how problematic Christianity had become. While Christianity aimed to be a religion of peace, it became so militarist that it even adopted burning people at the stake, which shows us how deeply the essence of the central civilization runs. How else are we to explain the fact that Christianity has been the source of more wars than the war ideologies of mythological origin? The Crusades against Islam in the East, the suppression of tribal religions and witches in Europe, later internal denominational fighting, and its role in the colonial warfare in the Americas, Africa, Australia, and Eastern Asia, led Christianity to completely stray from its aim. Assyrians, Armenians, Chaldeans, and Anatolian Hellenes, who were the earliest people to accept Christianity, clung to this religion because they thought it would be a remedy for the profound social problems they faced. But they too fell victim to the religion's ultimate ties to the central civilization. Christianity, which they interpreted as some sort of nationalism, rapidly brought them face to face with the power monopolies of other peoples. While Western Christianity achieved power at the cost of its essential message, Eastern and Anatolian Christianity were crushed by forces that put on the masks of both Judaism, the initial Abrahamic tradition, and Islam, its third version, and then were totally wiped out by other nationalisms, Arab, Turkish, Kurdish. Here we are confronted with the striking examples of how the social problem is augmented. So I must repeat my thesis. The Abrahamic tradition, inter alia Christianity, represents the immaterial culture that reflects the material culture of Central Civilization. More precisely, it aims to solve the grave social problem that this material culture, namely monopoly, has caused, just as real socialism sought to solve the problem originating in capitalism. But, because the science and ways of life they developed to do so did not in fact subvert the relevant patterns of the era and of modernity, they could not escape becoming a new version of the Central Civilization, that is either a new hegemon or a dependent, weaker power. Those who insist on remaining radical and sincere in their assertions cannot avoid being eliminated, although they will leave behind an important legacy. For this reason, I always compare the Abrahamic tradition to the social democratic movement of our time. Just as social democracy didn't go beyond patching up the grave problems caused by capitalist civilization, Abrahamic religions that played a more universal role over a long historical period were also content with some reforms, which were treated as the solution to problems caused by the Central Civilization that left masses unemployed, suffering, and hungry. In the final analysis, they were also unable to escape becoming a problem. The Abrahamic tradition, as an ideological and political program, is worthy of careful analysis, an analysis that is essential if we are to understand the capitalist world system in its entirety. These analytical efforts are of great value, both in connecting Immanuel Wallerstein's world system to the 5,000-year-old Central Civilization system, and for understanding how real socialism collapsed from within. When we analyze Islam, which is the third important Abrahamic religion, we can see the essence of this tradition more clearly. Islam represents a more proficient ideological and political orientation. When I look at the reality of the Prophet Muhammad, I always see him as the greatest representative of the last generation of the Sumerian priests, who constructed the first great divine concepts. Behind the Sumerian priests, who constructed gods based on mythological concepts, are the most advanced religious and mythological traditions of that period. We need to keep in mind that the Prophet Muhammad internalized, albeit in a limited way, the religious, mythological, and even philosophical and scientific knowledge that was available in his own time and place. Just as he knew about the tribal systems, he got to know the civilization from the reflections of the two global hegemonic powers, the Byzantine and the Sasanian empires. Muhammad diagnosed the grave problems both systems inflicted on society. In addition to the corrupting effects of Arab tribalism, he experienced firsthand the oppressive and exploitative structure of Byzantine and Sasanian power monopolies that blocked society's development and dismantled it. It is thus understandable that he sought a radical break with both systems. Like Jesus, he was closer to the lower social strata. He did not hesitate to sympathize with both slaves and women. Although he was influenced by the Mosaic and Assyrian priests, he was also a witness to their inability to solve the problems within their societies. He considered the pagan religions, the idols in Mecca, to be outdated traditions that had long ago run their course. The message of the last prophet, of the Abrahamic tradition, was one of the things that most attracted his attention. Under these circumstances, he did the best he could by daring to make the third major reform, which could also be called a revolution in the Abrahamic tradition. The position taken by Marx and Engels on the utopians, and Muhammad's position regarding the Mosaics, Christians, and even the Sabians, a group that also believed in one God, are similar. While Marx and Engels drew a distinction between genuine socialism and utopian socialism, Muhammad updated the outdated Abrahamic traditions in the form of a new truth. In other words, he provided a more realistic religious interpretation. The Quran and Hadiths are there. They emphatically preach not only an ideological and political program, but also a new morality. They also have their own economic principles. Muhammad even restructured the rules of war. I will analyze his method, which can be called the Prophet's Way, more comprehensively in the section that deals with science. For now, I will make do by saying that it is a good tradition. It could easily be argued that Islam, which has more advanced views than original Christianity and Judaism, is civilizational. Within 10 years of its emergence, it had succeeded in becoming the heir to all of the previous civilizations in the Middle East. Islam was able to establish the most powerful hegemonic ruling system in the region in 650 CE. Although the point here is not to address this particular history, we will continue to examine in relation to social problems in the region, as well as in the world overall, because it presents itself to the world as the good news. We can be certain that the Prophet Muhammad's understanding of Allah is a social abstraction of the highest order and an expression of social identity. I think Islamic theologians have been very lazy in this regard and are unworthy of Muhammad. The richness and evolution of this theology in Christianity has almost been suspended in Islam. I won't go into this any further here, as I will be returning to it later. It is nonetheless important to understand why Muhammad focused so heavily on the concept of Allah and charged it with such an enormous degree of sacredness. As I see it, Muhammad was not addressing a theoretical discussion about the existence of Allah, but rather dealt with the social essence of Allah. He poured a lot of energy into this, which is reflected in his exhaustion of fainting when delivering the hadiths. This should be taken seriously. Allah, referred to with 99 names, represents a more comprehensive social utopia and program than the most advanced social utopia, and in this regard, Muhammad is both realistic and responsible for his deference. The misfortune was not only the ignorance of those after Muhammad, but also that they were rapidly taken by a lust for power. Islam, as a revolution, is perhaps one of the most betrayed revolutions in this regard. Aside from not implementing the Prophet Muhammad's perspective, program, and way of life, the leaders after him, including the caliphs, failed to understand them and betrayed them in what they did implement. We cannot predict how well the Prophet Ali might have implemented the Prophet Muhammad's ideas, as he was unable to conclude his efforts. The interpretations and praxis of all denominations, especially Sunnism, are far removed from Muhammad's teachings. To put it baldly, the Sultanate traditions that began with the Umayyads are nothing more than power monopolies that are much worse than the ones that preceded them. I am sure that radical Islam is a disease of power that, far from reviving Islam, does it undeserved harm. It is most benefiting to refer to these ignorant Islamists as provocative Islam. If there is a message that can be taken from Islam, it would only make sense under a different name and in a different form. I leave further thoughts on this topic for later. I attach importance to the real monopoly of power in the name of Islam, but not as Islam, because Islam ceases to exist in this monopoly of power. It is nothing more than state symbols and rulers that follow in the footsteps of the Assyrian, Persian, Roman, and Byzantine lineages. I say this in relation to Islam as power. As an element of immaterial culture, there are, of course, areas where it is influential. I should emphasize that I do not see the utility of naming societies after ideologies. For example, calling a society Christian, Islamic, or Hindu reduces society to religion and leads to numerous inadequacies and errors. These concepts prevent an understanding of the actual nature of society The same applies to concepts such as capitalist and socialist society. I will return to this topic at a more appropriate point. The most befitting and meaningful concepts would be democratic civilization society and monopolistic civilization society, because that makes the whole of society visible. The Central Civilization systems had hegemony in the Middle East, which was by and large under Islamic rule from the 5th to the 15th centuries. Islamic rulers further expanded upon and further entrenched the power they inherited from the Byzantines and the Sasanians, and society was being ruled in an unprecedented way. There was an increase in the number of big tribes, dynasties, and states controlled by these rulers. As a result, there was no decrease in the pace of wars for power. In fact, increase continued. The military monopoly held the real power, but there were also developments in the trade monopoly. Islam is predominantly an ideology of military and trade monopolies. Cities grew, while developments in agriculture and industry were much more limited, as was also the case in the arts. It certainly failed to surpass what was achieved by the Greeks. The period of Islamic rulers and Islamic states marks the end of Middle East's hegemonic power. By the end of 15th century, the hegemonic core of the Central Civilization had shifted from Venice to Western Europe, and from there to Amsterdam and London. The Middle East was the Neolithic center between 10,000 and 3000 BCE, and was the central civilization for 4,500 years, from 3000 BCE to 1500 CE. Thereafter, under the weight of the enormous problems of civilization, the Middle East was worn out, had exhausted itself in attempts at self-renewal, and became, so to speak, a social wreck. When we evaluate the role of the Abrahamic tradition within the Central Civilization system in terms of problems, we see that it was unable to limit power. On the contrary, it further amplified it. States increased in numbers and grew in size. Therefore, the problems arising from monopoly of power in the state multiplied, and war continued to be the far preferred means for securing monopoly. Concepts of democracy and the republic were unknown. For the most part, traditional rule by a dynasty persevered and became more common. Second, the society grew weaker, while power in the state became stronger. The area of social morality and politics narrowed considerably, with denominations developing largely in response to this. Male dominance over women and youth grew apace. While the forms of slavery associated with pharaohic power disappeared, new forms of slavery, especially of Africans and Northern Slavic people, became commonplace. The city and commerce grew, but continued to lag behind their former glory, and never reached the level seen in the Greco-Roman city or its commercial life. Nor were there agricultural or industrial advances worth noting. Third, and perhaps most negatively, it gave rise to problems, which reached genocidal levels based in the prevailing tribal and people's nationalism within the Abrahamic tradition. The expression, the chosen servant and people of God, lies at the root of this nationalism. Initially, the Hebrews were considered the chosen people of God, and then the Arabs took the title of the noble people for themselves. The Turkic tribes went a step further, and the rubric of Islamic heroism turned being Islamic into a deep-rooted identity. Assyrians consecrated themselves as the very first people to embrace Christianity, while Greeks and Armenians would later insist that they were among the initial sacred peoples. The spread of Christianity to Europe played an important role in accelerating nationalism rather than universalism. Russian nationalism is also, in a sense, the product of Orthodox Christianity. Along with such an influence on tribal nationalism, the Abrahamic tradition didn't simply drown the ancient peoples of the Middle East in problems. It brought them tragedy and disaster. The most ancient peoples to become Christians, including the Assyrians, Armenians, Pontus, and Ionians, were brought to the brink of social extinction by these Islamized Arab, Turkish, and Kurdish rulers. The role of Judaism in this cannot be underestimated either. The elimination of Armenians, Assyrians, Ionians, Pontus, and Yazidis, as well as other non-Muslim peoples and their cultures, rendered the Middle East in general, and Anatolia in particular, cultural deserts. With the decline of these peoples, who carried with them the oldest known cultures, the region they had inhabited fell into extreme backwardness. This was a tragic loss for all the peoples of the region, as the elimination of these peoples and their cultures not only aggravated the social problem, but also substantially undermined attempts to find solution. Without these peoples and their cultures, which had been leaders of development in many branches of science and the arts, society in the region lost its artistic and scientific memory and ability. In the name of Christianity, similar tragedies were delivered upon the native peoples in North America, the Aztecs and Incas in South America, the indigenous people of Australia, and the Inuit. Even when they have religious attributes, regimes that are charmed by power and lust will commit any villainy and cause all sorts of problems and tragedies. I must emphasize that the perspective, program, and practical life of the Abrahamic religious tradition, under the significant influence of the material culture of the Central Civilization, is not attempting to surpass the civilization, but rather to mitigate it and make it fairer. The Abrahamic religious tradition sought a reform to allow them a share of the surplus value and the right to join the monopoly. They offered their ideology to legitimize power, and in exchange demanded their share from those in power. If their demand was not met, they instigated resistance, falling silent when their demands were finally met, something that we also see with European socialism. And as we shall see, there is a continuity between the two. They have both undoubtedly played a major role in the maintenance and universalization of this ancient civilization. In the end, the Abrahamic religious tradition failed to reduce the ancient social problem of oppression and exploitation. To the contrary, both oppression and exploitation increased and were perpetuated.